Welcome back to the Single Malt Review as we complete our foray through Balvenie's core range. And we mean to finish as we started with the DoubleWood. Only this time it's the 17-year-old DoubleWood.
Yes, indeed. Lucky last, but as the information might give away, it's made in a very, very similar principle to the 12-year-old. That is, it is a bourbon matured, I think exclusively bourbon matured in the case of the 17, and I suspect the 12-year-old as well. The information just wasn't quite as clear in that case, but 100% bourbon matured whiskey for 17 years, and then finished in a Oloroso sherry, or European sherry oak. So
They don't specify a particular variety, but different.
my money would be on primarily Oloroso, if not exclusively. But so what we've got here is a pretty facsimilis in terms of how it's made to the 12, but with a significant, this time, age difference, not just the 2 years that the Caribbean cask had for us. So this one should be really quite a good exercise in how Balvenie matures once it starts getting up there in age.
Yeah, once again, 43% ABV. Keep it consistent across the entire range.
Ooh, and we are back to the really, really sweet honey. It was quite interesting to watch. The 12-year-old was a very sweet honeyed whiskey, and then the Caribbean cask we thought was quite a bit drier and quite a bit sort of spicier, more restrained. Generally a drier whiskey, while also being just a wee bit smoother as well, paradoxically. Its maturity showing through there. This one is both... It's both smooth and sweet. Really, really sweet. I think this is sweeter than the...
It is a heavy, syrupy nose. In fact, it's more like a very heavy sherry maturation in some ways, despite it still only being a finish.
That finish has really, really stuck.
Many in some bourbon casks do really mellow out after a given number of years. You start to get a much weightier whiskey.
So, if one assumes the Balvenie is typified by a very sweet honeyed flavour, this is very typical Balvenie, because this is extremely sweet. This has got to be one of the sweeter noses I think we've had this year. It really is just dripping with sort of unctuous honey sweetness, I suppose you'd describe it as. As for what's sort of floating along in that river of honey, there's quite a bit of fruit, very, very ripe red fruit this time. It's almost beginning to deviate from Speyside into more of a Highland character.
There's a few cherries, a little bit of a Christmas cake.
Yeah, cherries are a good one. There's almost a sort of a maraschino cherry element too here, sort of a preserved candied cherry. But Christmas cake is an excellent one because it's a real coming together of these sweet fruits and nuts at the same time.
Kind of a brandy-esque spiritus warmth too.
Yeah, there's walnuts, hazelnuts. Hell of a lot of walnuts, actually, which is a huge, huge flavour in Oloroso sherry, if you've ever tried it. So, this one is a whiskey that is really, really wearing its finish boldly, very, very boldly. So, I guess that's good to see. And considering my complaint is often that finishes are sort of come out wimpy and don't integrate with the whiskey. So thus far, it seems to be, if not, it seems to be the dominant factor, really. So who knows? Let's see what's on the palate.
Blimey, that's good. If someone told me that was 100% cherry matured, I would believe them.
Yeah, that is massively sweet and quite deep and dark in terms of its character as well. Weirdly enough, I think for some reason, that prickly start to the palate is back again. It just has this spiky, youthful character that the Caribbean cask 14 seemed to have avoided somehow. And it's suffering from the same problem that the 12 had, and that I'm having trouble. The alcohol burn is such that it's difficult to really tease out complicated flavours.
Yeah, but it's quite profound for whiskey of this age and at this relatively modest strength.
I'll see if I can cure it with a bit of water. Not too much.
There's good lashings.
Surgical application.
Some dry sherry fruit flavours, but also some heavier sweetness of, say, a hearty bourbon, or indeed a little bit of brandy. Not me saying that brandy is inherently sweet, just you do get some sweet characters of it.
Now that's helped a wee bit. That has calmed things down a wee bit. It's not often I'd say that a whiskey is better at 40%, but having reduced this to sort of 40, 39, something like that, it is more approachable now. That prickle is reduced somewhat, but it's still there. It's a very keen, youthful whiskey for 17 years old.
It's turned into kind of like somewhere between an Aberlour and a Glenfarclas. It's got a real, I am very heavily sherry matured character to it. Even though we know it's not, it's finished in sherry, but it's coming across that way.
Was I to take a massive stab in the dark as to how this whiskey is made, I would say that they have used quite well used bourbon casks, second, maybe even third fill bourbons, the older in their stock, to mature this one, so that the underlying spirit, while properly mature at 17 years old, doesn't have an enormous strength of character on its own. It's just sort of good, light-bodied, matured whiskey. Shut up, that dog. I've got to pull his cord out. There we are. Ignore the beeps. And then applying that to the very, very active, I suspect, maybe even first fill Oloroso wood, has allowed that very, very light-bodied, not characterless, but a very, very light charactered whiskey to really, really soak up that finish and hugely, hugely display it. And I think that's what's going on here, which is interesting, but I don't know if it's 100% working for me, because it's bouncing around in my palate between a very, very light-bodied second, third fill bourbon matured whiskey, which it's probably typified by that Glen Ord we tasted probably a couple of months back. Now, a very, very, very light whiskey that sort of pulled on this jacket, I suppose you could visualise it as, of really, really heavily characterful Oloroso wood, which I think manifests better in the nose than it does in the palate, because you don't get that youthful, fiery nature from the light whiskey there.
As this breathes more, there's a little bit of a slightly vegetable, even slightly dank note on the nose.
I think we're getting a bit of old wood, which sort of supports my completely unjustified theory that it was in fairly well used bourbon casks. Old wood does have its own particular subtle note, and you normally need to put a bit of water in to find it, because that usually goes underneath the more the warmer flavours that come through with the higher alcohol. But to aid us in our investigation of this one, you've poured us a little comparison of what we had left of the 12-year-old.
The last of the 12-year-old, we had just enough left for a smidge,
so
a pocket-sized
in these Glen cans here, we've got a comparison of the 12-year-old DoubleWood. And yes, we own Glen cans. We're not freaks. I only use these ones for the videos because they're a bit, you can see them a bit better. It's off the table. But no, we drink out of Glen cans like normal people most of the time. Perfectly good glassware they are. I think mine is entirely from gift boxes and whiskey tours at this stage. Well, this one seems to have a nasty chip. I'll make sure I don't ingest anything horrible there. Never mind, I'm sure it's perfectly safe. So, I'm going to put a bit of water in straight off the bat so that they're the same strength. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a particularly direct comparison.
So, we tasted the 12-year-old at its full bottle strength, at least when we began. Let's bring it down just a little. There we go.
So, a much fruitier nose on the 12. Fresher, fruitier nose.
Curiously, I'm getting a lot more kind of buttery, cakey impressions off the 12 than I am. I'm getting a bit more overt fruit off the 17.
Yeah, I think the bourbon is more active in the 12 than it is in the 17. I think the wood used in the 17 is significantly more tied is the wrong way of putting it, but well worn, well used, well seasoned by previous fillings of whiskey than we have in the 12. 12 is much more of a bourbon matured seeming whiskey. I don't know if this has had a longer seasoning period, rather finishing period in the Oloroso, or whether it's just more active Oloroso that has gone in. But for whatever reason, the sherry wood is far, far more dominant on the 17 than it is on the 12.
Possibly just because the bourbon has that much more time to mature and mellow out in the way that bourbon casks do after a certain age.
It is quite
young bourbon casks have such a fresh, vibrant character, which is going to clash so much more with a sherry finish. The older your bourbon matured whiskey gets,
it's
the less
a bit of
a clash, the more it's going to harmonise and give a more consistent set of flavours, I think, which is what we're seeing in the 17-year-old.
It's a bit of a puzzle, really, exactly. Without knowing, without going and really seeing the guts of what a management process is in the distillery, which would be fascinating to ever find out, but I'm sure that's entirely proprietary information. Then it's all speculation, but that's is about as much as we can plumb the depths of that one with its 12-year-old as a comparison there. As for scores, this one I think is where it falters a bit for me. This one I think sort of brings back up my sort of slight prejudice for finishes, because in this case I think the Oloroso finish has kind of steamrolled what is a very subtle, albeit older, whiskey. Whereas I think the 12-year-old, it had a great strength of character from the bourbon. I think the 17 is a much lighter bodied whiskey on the inside, and so this finish that it's wearing is far, far more noticeable, which is good if you are in it primarily for the flavours that the finish brings. But if you're like me and you really want to see the whiskey's maturing heritage in there, in this case bourbon, to be expressed, I think this finish is too much on that one. And so I'll have to tread back a wee bit on my scores, and I'll score this the same as the 12 years old. I think it's certainly developed, but it's gone sideways rather than up for me. So my favourite is still going to be the bourbon cask. This will have to go back to 84 from me. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm thinking, reaching a similar conclusion but on a different path. I think in this case, the finish on the 17-year-old has worked in its favour. Instead of just completely clashing with what came before and creating something entirely new, which we saw in the 12, it's kind of punctuated the sentence which was written by that long maturation in bourbon casks. It's added to it rather than kind of overthrow it. And in my mind, it is just as good. I know it seems like a cop-out, me giving the same score to both, especially since you've done the same, but really they are both just as good to me, only in different ways. 88 points for me, just behind the rum finish, but still very good and really quirky in its own way. A good example of a different cask finish being used to the whiskey's advantage.
So there you have it. 3 different whiskies and 3 meaningfully different whiskies as well. I think they probably thought quite hard about their core range, and even though there's only a few years to separate what is pretty well uniformly bourbon matured whiskey, the way that they have played with different finishes has produced quite a diverse core range.
I've got to say, I'm both surprised and impressed, but there is such a stark difference between the 12 and 17-year-old DoubleWood.
They've certainly, I guess you'd say they've done a lot with a little in terms of making a fairly uniform base of their whiskey manifest in pretty different ways with these sort of finishes. To go back to my diatribe about their sort of craft focus at the beginning, I don't think I can't taste the difference when it comes to their sort of very hands-on, very craft-focused thing there. Maybe some people can, but to me, to compare this strengths and weaknesses to a completely ordinary distillery, I mean, we've just been doing Tomatin and they are perfectly mechanised there, I just can't... My tongue cannot realise the difference between something this craft-focused and something that is unabashedly not. So what you take from that might be less of a flavour thing and might be more of a cerebral thing.
So you can't necessarily taste the difference between a guy rolling the barrel across the floor versus someone using a forklift to achieve the same end.
It might be, I mean, a great... Whiskey, you enjoy whiskey with the nose and the tongue, but significantly in the mind as well.
Yes.
And if that craft thing helps the if that's something you like to think about,
Yeah, the story and the context can for some people add a lot.
Maybe it's for those people, but yeah, you are paying a premium for that. But we didn't with these little wee bottles, so that was convenient for us. And it is quite a wee good sampler. It's not every day you can get the entire core range of a distillery's output in one compact wee package like we did there. So very good for them to allow us that one. But yeah, that was, I think, unless you've got any other thoughts, that was Balvenie as far as their standard lineup goes on. I hope you were able to take away something valuable from that. We certainly were. We will get to work on something a bit more individual next, I suppose. But it'll be won't be far before we do another range next at least until we find another nicely presented wee gift pack there to save a bit of money on. So anyway, that's us at the Single Malt Review. Hope you found that informative. Slanjo, keep safe. Don't forget to subscribe. You can even like it if you wanted. Good grief. We will be right back with something else. Slanjo. Oh, we said it twice. Never mind. Bonus content.